He cancelled it, in the lobby of the hotel, with 6 crystal chandeliers watching, and the brass nameplate of his company shining like an accusation. Cameras were already pointed at the red carpet. Photographers hovered like moths. An MC was about to say the couple's names into a microphone that would echo into a live feed. He stood by a pillar and told the room he couldn't go through with it. He said the word people use when they want to pretend there's no more room for feeling. Protocol. The clap of a camera shutter sounded like a verdict. Haitong sat on the curb outside, rain soaking the hem of her dress, and the headline that would appear across the city's feeds later that night read, as if it had been typed by someone who had never seen the two of them together, one line that reduced a life to a scandal. For a moment, the world narrowed to a single horizontal line of headlights. Haitong's cheeks were wet, the mascara running in small, determined rivers. She hugged her knees and tried to tell herself she had expected this sort of thing after all. A marriage arranged with a handshake and a time limit was always a fragile thing. Still, sitting under a hotel awning with sugar from the wedding cake, somewhere between paper napkins and suitcase straps, she felt smaller than any of the doubts she had carried into the marriage. Where did this come from? How did two people who had promised to treat the marriage like an experiment end up in headlines? The answer, like most of her mornings, began at the bookstore. The store had been Haitong's life, long before the arrangement. A narrow shop wedged between a noodle place that always smelled faintly of fermented soy, and a bike repair shop whose owner whistled tunelessly at dawn. Shelves leaned like tired friends, and the cash register had a dent from when a neighbor's toddler had knocked it over. She watered a row of seedlings that sat on the back window so the tiny green leaves, a private, which Wellen kept a ledger of patrons who liked the same authors. The sign above the door read Quiet Pages, in hand-painted gold. The paint she had mixed herself on a Saturday, when she had nothing better to do. Grandma liked to say that marriage was a practical affair. She had called a meeting, 3 chairs in a living room, that smelled of jasmine tea and old paper. The family word for matchmaking carried no romantic pretense in Grandma's mouth. It was an inventory. Names, ages, professions. Zhanyin's name came across as a quietly spoken item on that list. Reserved, steady, wants low fuss, followed by a concession that made Haitong laugh and bruise in the same moment. He doesn't want to be trapped. Grandma liked sensible solutions. She liked to solve for peace. The 10-minute marriage seemed like a compromise everyone could live with. A quick registry wedding at the municipal office, 2 witnesses, a stamped certificate, and an agreement on paper, separate rooms, financial clarity, a 6-month trial, with a provision for extension. It will be like roommates, Grandma said, as if she were recommending a particularly sturdy broom. They signed with pens that squeaked in unison. Zhanyin, when asked about his job, said he handled some imports, a phrase so bland it might have been a joke. He looked at Haitong without quite meeting her eyes, and the air between them was an uncharted room. They moved into a 3rd-floor flat with a balcony, too small for proper furniture, and instead lined it with seedling pots. Zhan drove a small, humble van. Wuling and Haitong loved the way the van coughed on steep hills. It felt domesticated in a way that the idea of marriage had never done for her. They made rules, as if they were assembling a flatpack life. No sneaking in guests after midnight, Zhan said once in a voice that was meant to be neutral. Haitong wrote, no one is to sleep on the couch for more than 2 nights, in a margin of the agreement, and stuck a tiny leaf sticker beside it, like marking a favorite passage. Their domesticity had an awkward tenderness. Zhan would sit in the living room and read the shipping logs he insisted were technical papers, but which Haitong eventually learned were more like reports numbers that mapped a larger life he didn't offer up easily. She found small ways to encroach upon his solitude. A stack of books on the coffee table with notes in the margins, seedlings planted in old tea tins, a thermos she labeled with his initial. He, in turn, started leaving socks untidily by the door as a confession. He learned her every exhale. She mapped his silence like a constellation. The arrangement worked because both believed in temporary solutions. Haitong treated their contract like a trial she could end if motives soured. Zan protected an internal truth he refused to verbalize. He did not want his identity to be a lever used against the kind of affection he feared. He had seen marriages where wealth became the language of ownership, where declarations of love were ways to buy silence. He chose to be small. In public, it was an act of self-preservation that carried its own cruelty. The secrecy was meant as a shield. But shields have edges. Their life shuttled between small joys and the strain of pretense. Early one Saturday, Haitian and Zan parked the van by a nursery that smelled like wet soil and hopeful rot. They argued, not in the explosive way lovers do on melodrama shows, but in the arithmetic of plants. Which seedlings could survive the balcony's afternoon sun, whether a climbing vine would be worth the latter. Haitong haggled with the nurseryman like finances were a love language. Zan watched her bargain and widened his mouth into something like admiration. He bought, without arguing, a pair of climbing beans whose buds crawled like hands across lattice. At the bookstore, Haitong greeted customers with the same patience she had when she was 19, when the world had felt full of possibility and thin ledgers. Haitong, Haitong's younger sister, came in sometimes to stack paperbacks and eat stinky tofu from a plastic container in the back alley, sprinkling chili flakes on her palm without shame. Haitong was a brave kind of person. Impulsive, full of quick fixes, and secretly terrified of quiet. She had married early and in haste to a man named Joe Honglin, whose charm had been a mirror for his ambition. Where Haitong's life felt like a gently turned page, Haitong's was a manuscript with ripped corners. The trouble with Joe began small late nights, dismissed calls, a few sharp words, but it built like a storm you could see only by the way the trees leaned. He began to control the money. He insisted on holding the joint accounts for efficiency. He told Shao that she worried too much, and that if she wanted custody of their daughter she should be grateful for his oversight. The daughter, an age that had no patience for adult complications, learned the timing of footsteps and the meaning of closed doors. Haitong tried first to be helpful in the day-to-day. She would hand Haitong a folder with bank statements, tutor her in how to read transfer records, tell her which debts needed receipts. But help soon became something larger. Evidence needed to be collected, screenshots, receipts, whispered witnesses. Because Joe was gifted at making abuse look like care. He had friends who could make a message appear as if Haitong were the problem. One afternoon, Haitong arrived at the bookstore with a bruise the color of a bruised plum, and a smile she couldn't hold. She clutched a manila envelope and handed it to Haitong. "Keep this," she whispered. "If anything happens, if..." She could not finish. Somewhere in the process of recording what happened, an angle shifted. A private video, 2 minutes of argument hastily filmed on a street outside a bar, was edited and posted by an account that smelled of outrage and page views. It didn't show Joe's patterns. It showed a scene edited to make Haitong look violent, in defense of her sister. The comment section twisted the image into something worse. Gold digger, troublemaker, social climber. The narrative the internet favored was sharper than any truth. One clip, with the right cuts and the right voiceover, could make a helper look like an aggressor. The first time the hashtag spiked, Haitong was rearranging a display of second-hand novels. Her phone buzzed and buzzed until the power in the air felt like static. A customer and acquaintance who had folded into the bookstore's rhythm whispered, "Have you seen?" and left the tablet on a random news site. There she was, her face captured mid-gesture, mouth open, the breath caught in an expression that reading alone misinterpreted. They had cut the moment where she shoved Joe's phone away. In the edit, it looked as if she had struck him. The video had no context, only the gleam of conflict. It spread. Zan got the call in the middle of the night. He listened to a voice that named him by his family, as if that tethered him to a responsibility. His hands, steady, as always, tightened. "We need to freeze public appearances," Someone from a PR division said, "We need to control the narrative." The recommendation arrived like a cold sheet, efficient and ruthless. To them, reputation was a ledger to be balanced with surgical edits and press statements. The problem was not the truth of the video, the problem was optics. They decided to delay the announcement that had been planned as a small celebration, an event more for family than for public spectacle. The plan had been modest. A banquet in the family hall, a few speeches, a moment that would acknowledge the marriage without turning it into an industry spectacle. It was a nod to honesty. Yet pressure's a thing that acts like water. It finds gaps and widens them. Zungold. Haitong. He sounded tired without sounding apologetic. "It's smarter if we delay," he said. "They're advising that we not have any interviews. They think the context will take a while to recover." Haitong heard the words, but did not hear him. She heard the tone. The silence stretched underneath. She felt the decision like cold air moving through an opened window. The hotel lobby was warm that day. Photographers adjusted lenses and draped coats over chairs that smelled of perfume. Zon's voice, small against the clatter, allowed the cancellation to proceed, as if the weather had been the deciding force. It wasn't just a cancellation, it was the moment where the private agreements separate rooms. A 6-month trial met the public world and found it wanting. Haitong left in a hurry, her dress catching on the edge of a bench, as if the fabric itself understood that something had been torn. News fans streamed a live feed, commentators spinning possibilities. She heard someone ask, loud enough for the room to hear, "Did he back out because he never intended to stay?" The whisper rippled into the microphones like a contamination. Later that evening, after the last camera packed their lights and the marble floors cooled, Haitong went home and found the threshold adopt the shape of absence. Zon had left his key on the top of the shoe rack, as he often did, out of habit, not malice. Or so she thought. She had always known his absences were like weather. Sometimes they passed, sometimes they stormed. Tonight the key was not where it belonged. The lock clicked the same way it always had, indifferent to the human meanings accrued around it. She stood before the door and felt something inside her crest and break. The decision to lock the door, an act that had more to do with setting a border than with punishment, felt like the first true thing she had done since the marriage had been announced. She slid her key into the slot and turned slowly, then released it. The deadbolt slid into place with a solid, irreducible sound. She moved like someone performing a ritual. She left a note, folded in the way she folded seedling leaves. "If you're going to hide, do it where no one can find you. I'm tired of being part of a headline." She tucked the spare key under the potted thyme on the balcony for herself and for anyone else who might need to cross the border she was making. She did not tell Zon she had locked him out. She wanted him to feel, for a moment, how it was to be kept out of a life. The privacy she carved into that night did not taste sweet. It tasted like salt. Later, when the city had quieted to late-night radio, and the neon pulled its light inward, Haitong crept back into the apartment through the back window, the sill scraping her palm. The bedroom smelled like his sweater and jasmine from the shop comforts that belonged to a life they were both pretending to share. She crawled into the bed that was his territory when the door had been closed, and the agreement had made them separate. She lay there wide awake, breathing the linen, hearing every tick of the radiator, as if it were a metronome counting down to something inevitable. Sleeping in his bed that night was not an ending. It was a complicated reclaiming, a way to hold the line between anger and grief, between a sense of being publicly erased and a private claim to tenderness. She did not slide under the covers to forgive. She slid under the covers to feel what it was like to be closer to someone who had made so much of himself into a smaller thing. The room smelled of him and of their seedlings. The green and the salt turning into a private weather only she could inhabit. Zon returned early in the morning. He found the potted thyme moved. He found the spare key absent. He found the note. He stood in the doorway and read it with a blankness that carried the weight of more secrets than any word could hold. For a moment his expression was so small, it looked like a child's, an adult child's confusion about how to rebuild when both had been pretending they were not fragile. He had intended to protect her. Instead, his secrecy had become a brittle shell, sloughing off in ways he hadn't foreseen. The next morning, the internet had made up its mind. They had staged 1,000 verdicts on top of the existing rumor that Haitong had been used, that the marriage had been a PR stunt, that celebrities and netizens had been right to speculate. The hashtag trended in the way of modern fires fast and hungry. Strangers called the bookstore and left messages that started polite and ended with demands. "Refund my donation to your sister's case," someone wrote, as if the shop were a ledger of morals. A protest, small but loud, gathered outside quiet pages. Someone chalked the sidewalk with phrases about culpability and greed. The neighborhood noticed. Zahn watched from a distance, making calls to people whose titles blinked like warning lights on an airplane panel. "We need to prepare a statement," said his advisor. "No interviews. Emphasize family privacy." There was a brow-furrowing efficiency to their speech that left no room for human wreckage. To them, Haitong was a variable. To Haitong, the people lined up on the sidewalk were more than a trending topic. They were shards that projected personal narratives onto someone who had simply been trying to do the right thing. That was the moment the first real crack opened between them. Not because Zahn cancelled the public celebration. Grandma's careful orchestration and the pressure of optics might have persuaded anyone, but because the choice had been made in a room where her name was discussed and her feelings downgraded to a scheduling issue. Arguments between them in the days that followed were more like weather systems slowly crossing over each other. Long and full of the kind of small rages that are quiet but cumulative. They talked about strategy and optics when what Haitong wanted was to be seen and held. She wanted an explanation that had weight beyond corporate phrasing. He wanted to keep the identity he feared from turning their marriage into a transaction. He feared being loved for reasons that had the convenience of money at their center. He was, in the end, terrified of being owned. The sister situation, meanwhile, did not wait for them to settle their arguments. Haitong's custody claim was complicated by Zhou's financial maneuvering. Transfers in the night, a company in a neighboring province that owned consulting rights in the accounting, invoices that read like ghost stories. Haitong drove to the bank, sat through hours of customer service windows, and filled out forms until her fingers ached. She learned to read ledger lines like a map. Who had moved what, where, and why. The more she dug, the more patterns appeared. Evidence had to be precise. Accusation had to be above board. The law demanded facts, not feeling. A week into the scandal, a journalist named Zhong Nian Chenghe, cousin's friend, and a man with a sympathetic way of keeping his distance left a packet on her doorstep. He had not been a neutral bystander. He had seen the algorithmic way the internet could punish someone and wanted to help tilt the scale back toward truth. "You need to control the primary source," he said. He meant that the person who knew the real facts had to speak first. Turn off the chatter by delivering context. Haitong wanted to do that. But every time she picked up the phone to record a statement, she felt the words fall apart. There were legalities to consider, and the family pressed caution. Say too much, and you give the trolls more souvenirs. Say too little, and you confirm suspicions. Meanwhile, the messages kept arriving. Threats thin with performative righteousness, offers of help packaged as requests for interviews, sliding toward combat. A small victory came as a quiet, anonymous donation to Haitong's mounting legal fees, and a thread of usernames, who declared bravely and tenderly that they would support quiet pages. A woman from a neighborhood forum brought a tray of dumplings, leaving it on a stoop, with a note. "For the nights when you cannot sleep." The kindness reminded Haitong that public opinion was not a single voice, but a choir of fractured parts. But public pressure can be relentless. The PR advisors convened in sterile conference rooms, their phones blinking with mentions. They recommended damage control plans that relied on releasing controlled statements, supporting Haitong's sister's case, in a fashion that would show corporate responsibility, and then folding the issue into a narrative of privacy and family. Zahn watched them propose a path that would require him to step into a role he had fought to avoid. A public figure declaring a marriage he had kept compact and private. To the PR team, that would be a neat closure. To Zahn, it was a betrayal of his own fear. On the street, the protesters got louder. Quiet Pages was a small business. Small things feel large when they are under pressure. A customer who came in to buy a copy of a love poem left thinking the owner had been cruel. Another client who had read the older posts about the bookstore remembered the kindness and brought a bouquet of lilies. The contrast made Haitong dizzy with an ethic she had no time to practice. You cannot both be a target and a sanctuary at the same time. Arguments between Zahn and Haitong began to find new language. She accused him of cowardice. He accused her of exposing herself to a digital arena that had always favored the loud and the false. You think publicity will fix it? He asked once, very quietly. You think my being bigger than I am will make them stop? At least then they would know who I am, she said. At least then you wouldn't hide like a rumor. They both tried to mean different things by being known. Zahn's withholding had been a defense. Her anger stone and bright was both a rebuke and a plea. When the hotel's banquet cancellation became a headline, the following morning, the world that had been private turned brittle. The MC who had stood at the podium and never finished his sentence became a footnote. The cameras rewound and replayed his leaving. Pausing on the way, he folded his coat over his arm. The video looped. Someone added a voiceover. He backed out. She was left to apologize. A columnist wrote that the marriage had been a miscalculation, a misread of desire and social capital. The comments were swift and hard. Haitong's phone buzzed in the middle of a midnight she thought she would spend sleeping. A message lit the screen. Why didn't you tell me? It was from a journalist whose letters were always blunt. Do you have a statement? Her hands felt clumsy with the device. She had a statement. Truth. Context. The whole messy map of evidence. But truth is heavy to carry into a room where people prefer sound bites. The pressure to compress one's life into a line that would fit a story's headline felt obscene. In the flurry of backlash, the strangerly miracle of compassion persisted. Old customers stood by her at the shop and let protesters debate while they bought tea. A teacher from a local school spoke into a live feed about the kindness the bookstore had shown to children who came after school. Haitong's voice, young and brittle, found a steadiness when she recorded a short clip of her own. My sister is not the person they make her to be. The clip, honest and unadorned, gathered a modest counterwave of support. Still, the cancellation had been made, and the image of Haitong sitting on the curb with wet cheeks was powerful enough to become a symbol. It fit the narrative. The internet liked a woman wronged, a man fleeing responsibility. The truth was messier. It involved a man terrified of his own capacity to be loved for reasons that had nothing to do with money. It involved a family that preferred to fix appearances rather than wounds. It involved social platforms that rewarded quick judgments. In the quiet that followed the cancellation, Zahn tried to bridge the distance in ways that honored his fear and hers. He came to the store under the pretense of wanting a particular translation that had recently arrived. He watched her from the entrance, listening instead of speaking. He bought a book and left a single note inside the pages. I owe you an honesty I have not given. I will try. It was the start of something that had nothing to do with grand gestures and everything to do with slow, careful admissions. But the small acts were not enough to staunch the larger problem. The viral smear had set a legal process in motion. Haitong's lawyer filed papers demanding an accounting of transfers, and photographs of Joe's ostentatious purchases leaked to the press like water through a cracked pipe. The family line that had once been a protective circle now risked unraveling into public spectacle. As the days stacked up, the couple's nights grew shorter. She slept in his bed sometimes, and in her own room on other nights each. Decision and argument in miniature. She would lock him out when words failed her. A gesture of boundary setting more than punishment. He would stand in the doorway, phone in hand, his face soft with the slow ache of someone realizing that a life built on small untruths had the power to destroy more than it protected. One rainy evening, when the city had decided that scandal should be punctuated by weather, someone left a package on the bookstore stoop. A stack of unsigned pamphlets accusing Haitong of manipulation. The shop's windows were smeared with someone's attempt at a smear campaign. A neighbor called the police not because of damage but because the tension felt palpable and dangerous. Haitong stood in the doorway and watched a small crowd form. She did not feel like the heroine of any story. She felt like a woman whose life had been suddenly photographed at the wrong angle and posted for strangers to comment on. Zahn arrived with an envelope from a legal team, and a face that carried the exhaustion of someone who had stayed up with his own regrets. "We have to step back from social media," he told her. "Let us issue a measured statement about maintaining privacy while we sort the facts." To him, the statement would be a tool. To her, a statement could be either a clearing of her name or another layer of spin. She wanted to be defended, but she also wanted the person defending her to understand that defense wasn't degrees of damage control. It was moral clarity. Their exchanges became sharper. "You think someone who hides like you did should be listened to?" she asked, voice close to a snarl. "You think your silence makes you a saint?" "Silence isn't saintliness," he said, "but there are ways to step into the light without becoming a headline." "Do you think I'd rather be a headline than invisible?" she replied. They found no elegant answers. Sometimes all they found were the little salvations. A man who brought a tray of dumplings, an editor who promised to print the unedited bank statements, a neighbor who would stand outside quiet pages during the busiest hours to ward off the worst of the shouters. In a world eager to choose sides, small acts of loyalty were like anchors. And then came the banquet night. The plan had been to transform the family gathering into a statement. A prepared speech, a limited guest list, a careful press release. Some wanted it cancelled, some wanted it broadcast like a rebuttal. The small hall chosen for the event smelled of polished wood and floral arrangements, the air humidity kept in by heavy curtains. Guests arrived trimmed and nervous, plastic name tags stuck to silk. It was supposed to be a controlled environment, where the family would show unity and address the rumors without dramatics. But control is a fragile thing. When the banquet was half full, and the MC was rifling through a sheet of paper, a man from the protest crowd attempted to enter, claiming to have the family's right to ask questions. Someone misheard the insistent voice, and a supper table shuffled into confusion. A camera crew that had been waiting at the curb found. Now there was a commotion in the doorway. Voices rose like birds startled from a hedge. It was in this swirl that Zahn made the decision the public would not forgive. He stood and told the room they could not go forward. He said it with the flatness of finality. In doing so, he pulled a curtain across whatever plan they had for managing the story. Haitong, sitting in the front row with Grandma, looking at her like someone who had just been seen in a mirror, felt the room tilt. Cameras panned. Someone in the crowd laughed nervously and then was silent. He left the room without making promises or explanations, and the banquet that had been meant to be a solution became a spectacle of abandonment. She walked out into the hotel lobby where the rain made the pavement shine. A single reporter asked if she had been betrayed. Haitong had been human enough to be empty. She sat on the curb and watched his retreating back through the glass doors like someone watching a tide go out. The cameras kept filming, even as the main story had lost its script. That night, when the city took its impression of her and simplified it into 3 words, trending with a painful consensus, Haitong returned to an apartment whose doors had been used differently now. She pushed his spare key into the lock, and the motion felt ceremonial. She had locked him out earlier, in a fit of defiance. But tonight the lock was a different thing. It was not punishment now, but a messy, private way to hold what dignity remained. She lay in his bed again. Not as surrender, but as an improvisation. The covers smelled of his sweater, and the seedlings on the balcony. She thought of Haitong sleeping in a room down the street, that was patched with borrowed hope and an old teddy bear. She thought of Grandma, who had once taken a broom to a neighbor's porch to sweep off the superstitions that haunted the family. She thought of the seedlings, how even the smallest thing needs tending to not die. Outside, the city forgot one headline and found another. Inside, the bedside clock ticked, measuring a domesticated time that had nothing to do with trending topics. For the first time since the cancellation, Haitong allowed herself to let the curtain be drawn over the day. She tried to sleep, but sleep came like an inspector, slow, questioning, refusing to be duped by exhaustion. Zan returned at dawn. He read the folded note with a steadiness that was not stoic but measured, like someone who was used to calculating risk and now had to calculate repair. He entered the bedroom quiet as a man who had to practice gentleness in a craft he had never mastered. There was a tremor at the edges of his composure. He touched the coverlet, and then withdrew his hand, as if public duties had calluses where tenderness should be. They did not speak of the banquet's images the way a couple does in a crisis. They spoke the practical things first, because the practical keeps people from dissolving. Who would answer calls? Which lawyer would look at which bank file? How to deal with the protest at the shop? Then, in the residual quiet that follows practicalities, they attempted an honesty neither had been ready to offer earlier. "I'm sorry for choosing how to act in a way that made you feel small," he said. His voice was not the fleet of the press conference, but the narrower vessel of a man admitting a failing. "And I'm sorry I locked the door," she replied. "I didn't know what else to do. I wanted you to feel the house without me. I wanted..." Her words trailed. "You've wanted me to understand," he said. "I understand. I don't think my silence has protected you." He was careful not to promise more than he could keep. He promised to try. The promise felt like a tentative bridge. They stayed in the apartment that day. The internet churned, with both cruelty and kindness. The bookstore's front window reflected a skyline that was indifferent. At noon, a man from a neighborhood group called and asked if they could put up a small sign in support of quiet. Paige's Haitong found herself smiling, because the idea of a sign felt like the smallest form of allegiance, and she welcomed it. But the scandal had videos proliferated. A new clip of Joe's financial meetings leaked, and the line between private cruelty and public consequence tightened. The legal team that had been hovering with efficient darkness moved forward with motions. The world, which had been a parade of slights, became a sequence of files and subpoenas, paperwork that would take months to process and would not make her feel any better in the midnight hours. As evening fell, the couple walked to the van together. There were two people who had been married in 10 minutes, and now were trying to quiet the noise of an entire city. They argued about trivialities whose turn it was to drive the wooing, and then, when the argument dissolved, they shared a quiet joke about the shop's old register. They were learning, in small increments, how to carry one another's burdens without blending them into a single identity. Yet the undertow remained. Somewhere a voice was already drafting the narrative of a young woman left sobbing in a lobby, a man who had cancelled plans, and a city that loved scandal more than context. The story would not stop at headlines. It would reach into tribunals, servers, and the private rooms where decisions would be made. That night, after they closed quiet pages and turned off the lights, a neighbor who had once been a silent witness to their tender gestures left a single card on the cafe table. To the people who show up quietly for each other, we see you. Inside, someone had written in a hand that tasted like steadiness. Plant again. The seedlings need you. The card was small, but it carried the weight of private compassion in a time of public spectacle. They kept living by small truths. Seedlings planted in thrifted tins. A pot of tea left to cool on the kitchen table. A bit of toast burnt because someone had been lost in thought. In a city that could compress a life into a headline, such household rituals were stubbornly ordinary. They resisted the internet's appetite for spectacle, but the resistance was not yet sufficient. The viral smear had momentum, and momentum in the modern world favors the loud. Days passed. An envelope arrived, with a subpoena for bank records connected to Joe Honglin. Another envelope had the address of a journalist who wanted an interview. Haitong's lawyer called, with instructions to preserve digital messages. A friend offered to host a small forum where neighbors could come and speak, perhaps to diffuse some of the public vitriol. Each new item was a leva, a weighing scale that would need to be balanced. One night they returned from a meeting with the lawyer to find a crowd outside quiet pages, some bearing signs, some holding flowers. The protesters had not come to destroy. They had come with the complicated thing that sometimes happens when a city thinks itself moral. They had come to judge. They had also come to apologize. It was a confusing array. Some called for accountability, others for mercy. Haitong stood in the doorway and let them speak. And in the messy chorus, she heard both condemnation and kindness. Zan stood behind her, not imposing but present. In that posture, there was a kind of defense the internet could not easily caricature. He was physically there, a man who refused to let the noise sweep her away. The cameras would record the image and splice it for their own ends, but the human moment remained. They went back upstairs and closed the door. The lock clicked in with the same resolute sound it had the night she had first slid it across to keep someone out. It was a sound that said, "Here we are, with our own choices, and we will make of them what we can." And in the dark, with rain beginning to gather again, Haitong thought about what would happen next. She imagined the banquet that had been cancelled being picked apart in op-eds. She imagined the legal documents, like small, patient animals, gnaw at the corners of her attention. They could be patient. They could wait for the right moment to bite into something important. She imagined them as small, slow creatures that would not be hurried by outrage or haste. That evening she made a list, a habit she'd kept since the bookstore taught her to turn chaos into rosand. On the top of it, she wrote, "Evidence, lawyer, witness, statement." The list steadied her, like a ledger balanced in ink. The next morning began with paperwork. Haitong's lawyer, a brisk woman who smelled faintly of citrus and conviction, laid out the route like a map. Bank subpoenas, restraining orders, custody, affidavits. They were not cinematic, but they were practical. Each signature signed away a chance for Joe Honglin to use delay as a tactic. Each certified page narrowed the space in which his lies could survive. Zhang Yancheng proved to be more useful than the polite distance of a cousin's friend suggested. He had sources who preferred low light and high accuracy. He threaded together timestamps and receipts, traced a shadow company back to a series of transfers that matched the dates of Haitong's missing money. He offered a sober warning. Courts and platforms moved on different clocks. Proof could win a trial but might never undo the immediate damage of a clip that looped 10 million times. Still, he pushed for releasing primary sources and cut voice messages, time-stamped transfers, the photograph Haitong had of Joe handing over a contract. "Let the facts be heavy," he told Haitong. "Facts sink faster than rumors float." They planned carefully. Zan, who had always been used to other people's schedules, moved through the tasks with an unfamiliar earnestness, calling legal contacts, insisting the family's PR not sanitized to the point of erasing real suffering. For the first time they argued about public posture, with stakes beyond reputation. He wanted to stage a precise, deliberate release. She wanted to stand in front of people and show them the ledger that had been counted against them. They forged a compromise. A short recorded statement, from Shao, unedited and raw, and a coordinated leak of documents to a trusted journalist who had promised to present context rather than spectacle. They would not give the internet the rhythm it wanted. They would decide when and how to present complexity. The response to the first set of documents was not theatrical, it was, instead, stubborn and municipal. One news website printed the raw transfer logs. An editor included a line about how quickly small scams can be made to look like household disputes. A legal team filed motions. A prosecutor asked questions. People who had once typed cruel things into comment fields now typed apologies or silence. The hashtag that had been an uncontrollable swell lost steam. When evidence filled the empty places, journalists had tried to narrate. A mid-morning live stream showed Haitong in a quiet room, her thumb shaking slightly as she read a prepared paragraph. "My husband has used our joint account for purposes unrelated to the household," she said, voice raw but steady. "I am asking for custody and for an accounting. I want truth." The clip was 2 minutes long and uncompromising. It did not end with dramatic music. It ended with the sound of a paper sliding back into an envelope. The effect was quieter, but it made the city lean. If you like stories that unfold slowly, where a seedling becomes a tree, instead of a headline, consider subscribing and turning on notifications. You won't miss the next chapter. The small victory did not dissolve every problem. Legal wheels turned slowly, and there were setbacks disguised as procedural necessities. Friends advised caution. "Let them do their work," they said. It was sensible, and yet it left Haitong restless, in a way that had nothing to do with process, and everything to do with trust. She wanted to reclaim her life from the steady drip of strangers' judgments. She wanted to get back to the things that mattered most. The bookstore's quiet hours, the seedlings on their balcony, Haitong's laughter when she wasn't being brave. The family convened another meeting. Grandma, who had always preferred solutions that moved like a broom through a room, suggested a new banquet, this time explicitly designed as a private show of family unity. To refute the narrative that the Zan name could not stand for generosity, "We will invite important people who will speak sensibly," she said. "We will fix this like a seam." The PR team recommended a scaled-down event, controlled cameras, a curated guest list. For a moment the plan felt like a remedy, an orderly ritual that could be staged and closed. Zan resisted the idea of a staged recovery. He argued that staging the family into a tableau might only breed more suspicion, yet when he saw the way Haitong bristled at the thought of being paraded, his resistance softened. "If we do this," he said slowly, "I will go with you, not as a manufactured figure, but as myself, whatever that word means." The phrase hung between them. As myself. For both of them, the definition was still being written. The banquet was held in a private hall, past velvet curtains, and the kind of marble that caught light, like an audience. The guest list included a few family allies, a couple of local journalists who had promised balanced coverage, and a discreet camera crew hired by the family's legal counsel to ensure there were no later claims of misrepresentation. The room smelled of orchids and stern intent. People sat in small groups, speaking in low tones like people who had rehearsed sorrow in polite voices. Haitong felt a different kind of tension as they entered, a coiled energy that was less the raw sting of humiliation and more the careful pressure of being on display. But this time she had evidence in her pocket, and lawyers at the periphery. She had witnesses who would testify to Haitong's accounts. That knowledge gave her a small steadiness. Midway through the evening, someone in the crowd brought up the topicality of the moment. He wanted to ask a pointed question that leaned toward accusation. It was the sort of small provocation the internet loved to film. Zan saw the man and recognized him. A former associate of Joe's. The sort of person who greased closed doors and traded favors like currency. The man began to speak loud enough for the recorded feed to catch a tone of insinuation. "Do you deny that this was a publicity stunt?" he asked, voice sharpened. Zan rose. The room quieted like a tide, pulling back. For a breath, it seemed he might be about to do what he'd often done. Find a measured, protective phrasing that avoided spectacle. Instead, the words he chose carried the weight of months' worth of thought. "My name is Zan Yin," he said. The room registered the ordinary syllables like someone seeing a face out of a crowd and then noticing it belongs to someone known. "I am the chairman of Zan Logistics." The name landed in the hush like a bell. Someone in the back made a small noise of recognition. The cameras, quiet until then, pivoted. The reveal was not a theatrical soundbite he had planned. It was a decision that had the feel of urgent repair. He told the small room why he'd hidden his status. He feared being loved for the wrong reasons, feared that the architecture of power could turn affection into ownership. He explained that his secrecy had been a clumsy attempt to make affection arise from care rather than obligation. His voice did not have the confident cadences of a press conference. It had the brittle honesty of a man offering an unpopular confession. The effect in the room was immediate and mixed. Some guests softened in their seats at the sight of sincerity. Others bristled at the thought of having been kept in the dark. The man who had provoked the question did not accept the explanation. He stood and shouted an accusation clipped from social feeds, something about a PR circus, about deception. The air leaned toward confrontation. Before Haitong could decide how to respond, the man produced an envelope and flicked it open like a stage trick. Inside were photographs. A series of images that appeared to show Zan's office receipts, theatricalized snapshots, meant to suggest the relationship had always been transactional. One of the images was outdated. Another was a forgery. A figure from Joe's circles, someone whose loyalty had always been pragmatic, brought in what he hoped would be the final proof to discredit Zan's defense, a claim that the couple had once been photographed together in an event staged by Zan's team. The hall erupted. Voices, cameras, the scrape of chairs. In the blur, someone pushed through the crowd. It was not a gentle shove but a movement with a hard edge. A hired provocateur who had been waiting for permission to act. Security moved in, but the man lunged in a way that was more about making a point than doing harm. In the scramble, a glint of metal reflected the chandelier's light. A sound, like a small crash. Someone fell. The precise choreography of injury is rarely elegant. It is sudden, shocking, then measured in ambulance lights. Zan was struck an impact that sent him to the floor with a copper taste in his mouth. It was not the blade of a melodramatic movie. It was a quick, ugly moment, where provocation became physical, and the cost of truth became flesh. The hole froze. The cameras captured the sound of breath that had no wherewithal to be brave. Security wrestled a man away. Someone shouted for an ambulance. Haitong crouched beside him because instincts had not been trained by PR manuals. They had been trained by the quotidian exercises of care. They took him to the hospital, with the flurry of compressed compassion that modern emergencies deploy. Sirens, a curtained bay, hands that worked in circuits of competence. Haitong rode in the back seat beside him, her hand finding his as if it could anchor both of them to a sense of what mattered. He looked at her. The stoicism peeled back like paint. "I thought hiding would protect us," he said once, voice a whisper under the groan of the vehicle. "I didn't think it would do this." At the emergency entrance, the team moved with clinical precision. Haitong was waved aside both for her safety and because there are things in operating rooms that do not need witness to be witnessed. She stood in the waiting area with the kind of helpless focus she knew from nights spent waiting in maternity wards for births she could name by smell, a specific intensity that honed the edges of a heart. The PR spin doctors tried to warp the moment into meaning. Some called hospital visits calculated, some called them noble. The internet's appetite expected a neat narrative. Villain exposed, hero wounded, love tested. But the truth was less tidy. in a fluorescent corridor, with machines humming like a city. Haitong felt everything quieted into a small, fierce presence that belonged only to them. Zan's injuries were not dramatic in a cinematic gore sense, but they were real enough to make his composure crack, and honest enough to force a conversation that could no longer be sidestepped. When he crawled back to consciousness, the room had the pattern of a sacred place. Dull light, the muffled counter-pulse of monitors. A sheet, tucked like a promise. Haitong sat close, her hands clasped around a paper cup of hospital tea that had gone cold. She had prepared herself to be tender, and to be angry, and to be discerning, all at once. The city had seen her tears once in a lobby. This time she wanted any expression to be chosen. He opened his eyes, and found her face first. For a moment, he seemed surprised at the ordinary miracle of her being there. "You slept in my bed when you locked me out," he said, a small, rueful smile folding his features. It was the kind of observation that was both tender and charged with meaning. "You could have left." "I needed to know where I stood," she answered. Her voice was steady, by necessity. "I needed to feel what it was like to be closer to someone who wasn't going to let the world decide for them." She paused. "And I slept there to be near the thing that hurt me." He swallowed. The hospital was a place that reduced the grand to the essential. Handholds, steady breath, the weight of apology. He tried to piece together a confession that wasn't theater. "I didn't tell you my name because I was afraid," he said. "I was afraid someone would think my wealth defined me, and would buy affection. I thought if you stayed it would be because of who I was, not because of seedlings, jokes, book margins." He coughed. "I know that sounds small." "It doesn't sound small to me," she replied. "It sounds like someone trying to keep his heart safe. But safety isn't a thing you build with walls and silence. It's a thing you build with hands. With transparency, with being there when it matters." He closed his eyes and let the truth in like sunlight. "I don't want to be the kind of person who lets reputation make moral choices," he said. "I wanted to control the narrative, instead of correcting it honestly. I see now that control was cowardice. I'm sorry." The confession was not an immediate absolution. Trust, they both knew, was not a formula that could be signed in a ward. It had to be earned, again and again, in small acts. He was not asking for dramatic forgiveness. He was offering a route forward. Honesty as policy. No more secret accounts. A public statement that would not be PR speak but a candid admission, and a plan to set things right. Haitong listened and, in the space where compassion sits with judgment, she let him speak. She told him about the nights she had held seedling pots, and wondered if they'd keep. She described Haitong's rawness. The money disappeared like a small animal, into the gutters of the city. She asked him for concrete things. Will he publicly commit to supporting Haitong's legal fight, without making it about family image? Will he ensure the company won't attempt to smooth things over by buying silence? Will he stop hiding? He answered each question with a clarity he had rarely allowed before. Yes to public truth. Yes to legal support. Yes to transparency. He signed an agreement in the hospital practical, not symbolic, authorizing immediate transfers for Haitong's legal fees, and a safe fund for custodial expenses. He directed that his company's PR group coordinate with Haitong's counsel only through ethical channels. The actions were small and surgical. The kind of things that speak louder than speeches. Outside the hospital, Zheng Chang worked with journalists to release a fuller set of documents that exposed Zhou's patterns. He refused sensational language, and insisted on public records and archival receipts. The reporting that followed was steady rather than hungry. Another journalist picked up the narrative thread and traced the ghost company back to an offshore account, linking specific purchases of luxury items to dates that matched the missing funds. The article used quiet facts instead of inflammatory adjectives. It gave prosecutors a path and made it harder for trolls to sustain a false narrative. Legal consequences followed in a way the script of justice sometimes longs for: a subpoena, a formal investigation. A court-ordered freeze on certain accounts pending review. The language of consequence is never as satisfying as an on-screen villain being hauled out at dawn, but it was effective. Zhou Honglin's counsel attempted to turn every procedure into delay. But the layers of documentous bank logs, time-stamped messages, witness statements made the path forward clearer. Haitong received a temporary custody order, protected from financial manipulation while the case progressed. It was not miraculous. It was the result of patient, methodical work. Public sympathy that had been raw and directionless began to realign. People who had once typed derision now typed concern. Old customers left notes and flowers. A small chain of community volunteers organized a fundraiser to sustain quiet pages through what threatened to be a long legal slog. The neighborhood became a slow chorus of practical support. Meals, errands, someone to watch the shop for an afternoon while Haitong and Zan met with lawyers. As Zan healed, the couple moved through an awkward domestic choreography. Healing, for him, meant learning to be visible in ways that weren't performative. For her, it meant relearning how to accept support without feeling diminished. They developed small rituals. He would read aloud inventory lists to her, and ask for her opinion on how to phrase a public statement. She would teach him the names of the seedlings and how to coax them through winter. They argued less about what should be hidden, and more about what could be shared. Grandma, who had watched their marriage, like someone following the progress of a storm through a teacup, softened in her way. She came to quiet pages, with a thermos of jasmine, and an apology tucked into the way she pressed the cup into Haitong's hands. "Sometimes you choose a broom when a conversation is needed," she said. It was an admission that held both regret and a wish to mend. In time, the public wounds scabbed into something less raw. The narrative that had once compressed Haitong into a single image now had footnotes. There were articles that spoke of manipulation and consequence, and there were op-eds that reflected on the internet's appetite for simplified stories. The couple still avoided the headline machine when possible. They had learned that privacy could be both armor and a trap. They chose transparency by intention, not by release. One afternoon, as the weather strictly refused to settle into any particular mood, Zan brought home a small cardboard box tied with string. Haitong opened it, to find a tiny potted plant and a key inside. The key had belonged to the flat's old front door. The one they had used before the lockout drama began to feel like a ritual. He watched her face as she turned the key over. "For the front door now," he said. "A symbol that you don't have to prove your place to anyone." She laughed, and it was a light that softened years into a single moment. She slid the key into her pocket and touched the plant's new leaves like someone acknowledging a promise. They planted the seedling together on their balcony that evening, their hands in the dirt, the city humming below them. It was not a vow shouted into open microphones. It was a tiny covenant of tending. Haitong's custody hearing ended with a ruling that favored her right to care for her daughter while providing mechanisms to protect both mother and child from financial exploitation. The court ordered provisional accounting, and prosecutors continued their work on the fraud case. It was not a fairy tale ending. It was legal reality. But when Haitong came into the bookstore and hugged Haitong, with the kind of unadorned gratitude that has no need for audiences, that was the true resolution the sisters had been fighting for. The family line also adjusted. Some relatives who had been skeptics became allies when they saw evidence rather than theatrics. Others kept distance. The city is sometimes a place where social ties fray differently than private ones. Grandma, who had started the arrangement with broom-clean logic, learned to sit with ambiguity and allow for the work of forgiveness. As the months folded, quiet pages recovered a rhythm. Customers returned in waves. Some sought to show loyalty, others shied away. Haitong cataloged a stack of new donations for Haitong's legal fund, and kept a ledger of who had offered what. It was a list not for show but for memory, a way to remember how small things had added up into a kind of rescue. One morning, after a long night of rain, Zan surprised her with a breakfast he had prepared badly but with heart. eggs burned slightly, tea bitter, a handwritten note left on the table. I am committed, the note read, to truth, to seeing you, to seedlings, and to mending fences the right way. No more half-truths, no more hiding. He left a small key beside the note. This time the key to the bedroom. It was a quiet, private handing over, a simple symbol that carried more meaning than a public declaration. She took the key and folded it into her palm. You don't get to keep being small in the ways that hurt others, she said. And I don't get to make you small for being afraid. We get to be complicated and try. That's the transaction we're finally entering. They laughed at the word transaction because it felt like a relic of the very things they'd been dismantling. The morning light played across the table, and the seedlings by the window. It was ordinary, and therefore, for them, large. In the months that followed, there were small, domestic epiphanies that felt like true maturations. They went seedling shopping on a cool Saturday and argued about which potting mix to choose with the kind of delight that used to be reserved for vacations. Haitong allowed herself to be photographed once by a local magazine that wanted a human interest story on resilience. She agreed on the condition that the piece be in her words, and not someone else's. Zahn sat with her in the interview and answered questions about partnership without deflecting into corporate platitudes. There were still nights when the internet's appetite could spark new controversies. An old photo resurfaced. A critic rehashed the storyline, but those moments no longer had the power to unmake them. They had built scaffolding, legal truth, community support, and an ongoing practice of transparency. On an ordinary evening, after they had closed the store and swept the floors, Grandma came in with an old card she had kept folded in her pocket for reasons she didn't quite explain. Inside, in a hand that trembled with age and resolve, was a sentence: grow things together. It was not the most eloquent of absolutions, but it had the weight of someone who had watched many seasons and learned to let the small things matter. They walked home together under a streetlight that hummed like a neighborhood lullaby. The woolen coughed once, and then settled into the street, as if it, too, had been chastened into patience. Zon drove a Haitong beside him, with a thermos of tea in both their hands. They passed a child who was walking a dog, and a couple arguing quietly on a porch. Ordinary scenes that did not require their commentary. At home, there was a new ritual. A small envelope left on the kitchen table every Sunday morning. Sometimes it contained a note, sometimes a coupon for a free baked good from a neighbor, sometimes nothing at all, except a reminder that the habit of generosity needed tending. The last envelope that season held two things: a small card with a thank you from Xiao Chong for standing with me, and the spare key to the flat's front door, now officially returned and exchanged. They had started as an experiment. 10 minutes at a registry was how the world had first signed them together. A compromise that was meant to be cautious, but the experiment had evolved into a deliberate project. The slow work of learning to ask for what one needs, and to answer with more truth than fear. It was not a grand romance of fireworks and public vows. It was a marriage grown out of seedlings and temperate apologies. One evening, years later, in a future that smelled faintly of old paper and tending, they stood on the balcony and watched the seedlings they'd once thought fragile become a small thicket of green. A neighbor's child pointed and asked what they would be in a few years. Beans and a lot of stubbornness, Haitong said. Zan laughed. And maybe a few more apologies that matter. They held hands without thinking, and felt the ordinary solidity of two people who had chosen to keep trying. The city beyond still loved scandal, and the internet would always have appetites for simplified stories. But inside their flat, behind a door that had once been a battleground, honesty had become the rule, rather than the exception. If this twist surprised you, like and share, and if you want more stories where ordinary kindness wins back a life from a headline, watch the next episode in the playlist.